I have learned, the hard way, that destruction rarely announces itself with noise. Most of the time, it arrives quietly, dressed as routine, hiding behind signatures and polite smiles. My name is Andrew Whitmore, and until everything in my life was methodically dismantled, I was a senior civil engineer specializing in large-scale public infrastructure projects. I designed highways, flood control systems, and municipal facilities, structures meant to endure pressure, time, and human error. I was 43 years old when my marriage and reputation were stripped from me in a matter of months, but the seeds of that collapse were planted long before any court filing or legal notice ever reached my door. I was known as disciplined, analytical, and dependable, a man who believed that rules existed for a reason and that commitments, once made, carried weight. If you love ruthless revenge stories packed with shocking twists, like this video and subscribe now. New, never-before-seen stories are released here every day, each more intense than the last. I met my wife, Lauren Whitmore, when I was 31 and she was 27, at a professional development conference hosted by a consulting firm that worked closely with state agencies. She stood out not because she was loud or dramatic, but because she observed carefully, asked precise questions, and remembered details others dismissed as unimportant. At the time, Lauren worked as an administrative coordinator for a legal services organization that provided logistical support to judges and senior attorneys. I was already well established in my field, working for a national engineering firm with a strong reputation and steady government contracts. Our conversation started with work-related topics, evolved into discussions about ambition and values, and eventually became long dinners that felt purposeful rather than impulsive. She admired my structure and stability. I admired what I believed was her intellect and restraint. We dated for nearly 4 years before getting married, years that felt balanced and intentional rather than rushed. By the time we exchanged vows, I was 35 and she was 31, both of us financially stable, educated, and confident that we were entering a partnership built on mutual respect. I earned significantly more than she did, but Lauren was insistent about maintaining her independence, emphasizing how important it was for her to have her own career and professional identity. I respected that without hesitation. Friends described us as grounded, private, and mature, the kind of couple who avoided unnecessary drama. What none of them knew, and what I failed to recognize, was that Lauren was not simply building a life with me. She was studying systems, influence, and leverage with quiet precision. For several years, everything appeared exactly as it should. My career advanced steadily, promotions followed completed projects, and my name became associated with reliability in regulatory circles. I invested carefully, acquired property, and registered most assets jointly, believing that marriage meant shared ownership and shared risk. Lauren transitioned from administrative duties into a legal liaison role, working closely with court staff, attorneys, and occasionally judges, coordinating documents and managing case logistics. She often spoke critically about corruption, about how flawed the system was, and how frustrating it felt to watch dishonest people manipulate outcomes. I listened, unaware that she was learning how that manipulation actually worked, not to fight it, but to master it. The change was gradual enough to escape notice. Lauren began asking detailed questions about my finances, asset structures, and long-term holdings, framing them as concern for our future security. She encouraged consolidation, simplification, and shared oversight, all of which sounded reasonable coming from a spouse. At the same time, she started spending longer hours at work, attending conferences and legal retreats that required travel and late nights. I never checked her explanations. I never followed up. I believed trust meant not auditing the person you loved. That belief would become the most expensive mistake of my life. The divorce filing arrived without warning on an otherwise ordinary weekday morning. There was no argument beforehand, no emotional confrontation, just legal documents accusing me of financial misconduct, emotional neglect, and concealment of marital assets. Within days, court orders froze accounts I depended on, restricted access to properties I had worked years to acquire, and suspended professional contracts due to pending litigation concerns. The judge assigned to the case approved motions with alarming speed, denying requests for hearings and allowing temporary orders that functioned as permanent transfers. As an engineer, I understood process, and this was not process. It was execution disguised as procedure. Someone was controlling the outcome long before the case was ever heard. It was during this free fall that Margaret Collins, a retired court administrator and longtime family acquaintance, asked to see me privately. She chose a quiet diner far from courthouses and offices, a place where conversations faded into background noise. When we sat across from each other, she slid a folded sheet of paper toward me. On the front, written neatly in black ink, was a title that made my stomach tighten: How Everything Was Taken. Inside was a detailed list: names, dates, asset movements, unexplained rulings, and procedural shortcuts. One name appeared repeatedly, someone I didn't recognize at the time but would soon come to understand. Margaret looked at me steadily and said, "Your wife didn't do this alone." As I read through the list, anger gave way to clarity. This was not a messy divorce or an emotional overreaction. It was a calculated extraction, coordinated through legal influence and protected by procedural camouflage. The list outlined how filings were fast-tracked, how valuations were manipulated, and how narrative replaced truth in official records. It named a man connected to Lauren both professionally and personally, someone positioned between judges and outcomes, someone who understood exactly how to bend the system without appearing to touch it. By the time I finished reading, one thing was clear: this was not just betrayal. It was theft conducted under the authority of law. That moment marked the end of who I had been and the beginning of something far more deliberate. I did not shout. I did not confront Lauren. I did not rush to expose what I knew. Instead, I folded the paper carefully and put it away. I understood then that emotional reactions were exactly what had been anticipated from me. What they had not prepared for was patience. If they had used the system as a weapon, then I would learn its mechanics well enough to turn their certainty into evidence. That list was not just proof. It was a blueprint. And this was only the beginning. The days that followed my meeting with Margaret Collins forced me to confront a reality I had never imagined for myself, not as a husband and certainly not as a professional who believed in systems and order. I moved through my routine as if nothing had changed, attending hearings, answering emails, and showing up to meetings with the same restrained composure I had always relied on. Inside, however, my thinking had shifted entirely. I stopped reacting emotionally to each new legal blow and began observing patterns instead. Every ruling, every filing, every delay or acceleration told a story, and once I learned how to read that story, the shape of the trap became unmistakable. This was not chaos. It was design. Lauren's accusations were crafted to provoke panic, while the court speed was meant to prevent scrutiny. They expected me to collapse under pressure, to lash out or make mistakes that would justify everything written about me in those documents. One name on Margaret's list stood out more than the rest: Thomas Reed. He was described not as a lawyer or judge, but as a legal strategy consultant, a title vague enough to avoid regulation and powerful enough to grant access. Public records showed him attached to advisory boards, judicial workshops, and non-profit legal reform initiatives that conveniently placed him in private rooms with decision-makers. The more I researched him, the clearer it became that Thomas existed in the margins of authority, where influence thrives without accountability. His name never appeared on official filings, yet his presence hovered around cases that moved unusually fast and resolved unusually cleanly for one side. When I cross-referenced timelines, I realized Lauren had met him years before our marriage, during her early work as a legal coordinator. That meant this was not a sudden affair or opportunistic betrayal. It was a long-term alignment of ambition, patience, and access. I began reconstructing the sequence of events with the same rigor I once applied to forensic engineering reports. Lauren's growing interest in asset structures was no longer innocent curiosity. Her insistence that I consolidate accounts and simplify ownership wasn't about efficiency, it was about reducing friction when transfers needed to occur quickly. Even our marital arguments, which I once believed were organic, aligned too neatly with legal milestones to be coincidence. Disagreements escalated just before filings. Reconciliations followed favorable rulings. Emotion had been used as camouflage, and I had walked straight into it because I trusted the person deploying it. What unsettled me most was how easily the court accepted narratives without verification, as if documentation alone carried moral authority. No one asked for independent audits. No one questioned contradictions. They assumed paperwork equaled truth, and Lauren had mastered that assumption. Rather than challenge the trap head-on, I chose to understand it fully before attempting escape. I consulted a financial compliance specialist under the guise of preparing for worst-case outcomes, asking neutral questions about asset freezes, valuation disputes, and procedural abuse. I reconnected with former colleagues who had moved into regulatory and oversight roles, never mentioning my case directly, but listening carefully to how investigations were triggered and sustained. Most importantly, I cultivated the appearance of defeat. I let my posture slump in court, delayed responses just enough to seem overwhelmed, and stopped contesting minor motions altogether. Lauren grew visibly more confident with each passing week, mistaking my restraint for surrender. She pushed harder, demanded more, and accelerated timelines that should have been treated with caution. Every ounce of her certainty generated another inconsistency, another shortcut, another thread waiting to be pulled. By the end of that month, I no longer felt trapped. I felt informed. And in conflicts like this, information is not just power, it is inevitability. By the time the third phase of the proceedings began, I had fully abandoned the idea that justice would arrive on its own timetable. What replaced that belief was a disciplined patience rooted in preparation, the same mindset I once applied when reinforcing aging structures against failure. I reorganized my days around documentation and observation, keeping my public behavior deliberately subdued while my private work intensified. I stopped attending hearings with the goal of winning arguments and instead treated each appearance as a data-gathering exercise. Every objection, every hurried ruling, every dismissive remark from the bench added context to the larger picture. I recorded timelines, preserved correspondence, and archived filings with redundant backups, knowing that truth becomes fragile when left to a single source. Lauren's legal team mistook my silence for fatigue, unaware that silence was allowing me to see the architecture of their advantage more clearly than noise ever could. The most important decision I made during that period was to hire a forensic auditor whose background had nothing to do with family law. He specialized in corporate malfeasance, regulatory evasion, and financial misrepresentation across institutions that assumed no one would ever connect their records. I presented him with fragments rather than accusations, bank statements, valuation reports, court orders, and asked him to analyze discrepancies without knowing the personal stakes involved. His conclusions were methodical and devastating. Asset values had been adjusted without proper justification. Transfer dates conflicted with registry updates. Temporary restrictions had functioned as irreversible seizures. Most revealing of all, the same assumptions appeared repeatedly, that no one would cross-check systems designed to operate independently. He explained that corruption survives not because it is hidden well, but because it relies on complacency. That insight became the foundation of my counterweight. While the auditor worked, I expanded my focus to Thomas Reed's sphere of influence, understanding that dismantling outcomes required tracing inputs. I studied his public affiliations, board memberships, and speaking engagements, mapping how they intersected with judicial training programs and policy forums. He was careful, always presenting himself as a neutral advisor advocating efficiency and reform, yet patterns emerged that no rhetoric could disguise. Judges who attended his workshops ruled with striking consistency in cases linked indirectly to his consultancy. Lawyers he collaborated with benefited from expedited procedures and favorable interpretations. None of it was explicit enough to accuse, but together it formed a signature of influence that contradicted claims of neutrality. I resisted the urge to confront him or expose what I knew prematurely. Pressure, I reminded myself, is most effective when applied to load-bearing points, not surface details. Lauren, emboldened by what she believed was my deterioration, began overreaching. She demanded accelerated settlements, filed motions accusing me of intentional delay, and requested penalties that stretched credibility. Through indirect channels, I learned she had begun planning life beyond the litigation, spending money not yet legally secured and celebrating victories still dependent on fragile assumptions. Her confidence created carelessness. Exhibits were submitted without cross-verification. Statements contradicted earlier filings. Dates drifted. My auditor flagged each inconsistency, cataloging them patiently while I maintained the appearance of a man too overwhelmed to notice. By the end of that chapter, I had assembled something far stronger than outrage or resentment. I had built a counterweight grounded in facts, timing, and the predictable behavior of those who believe they are untouchable. The balance was shifting, even if no one else could feel it yet. The moment I decided to move from preparation to pressure was marked by restraint rather than confrontation, because I had learned that visibility was both a weapon and a liability. I initiated a narrowly framed procedural challenge that appeared insignificant on the surface, targeting not the divorce ruling itself but a technical inconsistency in the timing of asset valuation submitted to multiple registries. To anyone watching casually, it looked like a desperate attempt by a man clinging to procedural crumbs. In reality, it forced the court to request synchronized documentation from agencies that had never been required to align their records before. That single request disrupted the quiet cooperation Lauren and Thomas depended on. Registries responded at different speeds. Numbers failed to match. Clerks submitted explanations that contradicted sworn filings. None of it accused anyone outright, but it created friction where smoothness had been assumed. Systems built on shortcuts cannot tolerate friction, because friction generates questions, and questions invite oversight. The response was immediate, though carefully masked as irritation rather than alarm. The presiding judge attempted to narrow the scope of review, issuing curt directives meant to limit discovery, while opposing counsel accused me of abusing procedure to delay closure. I welcomed every objection, because objections generate transcripts, and transcripts create records that cannot be erased without consequence. With guidance from my auditor, I submitted supplemental documentation that highlighted discrepancies without assigning motive, allowing the evidence to exist independently of my credibility. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Margaret Collins confirmed that internal discussions had begun, not about my behavior, but about procedural exposure. Lower-level staff, suddenly aware that their names were attached to irregularities, became cautious and defensive. Meetings were postponed. Deadlines slipped. The same speed that once worked against me now became a liability for those who relied on it, because rapid outcomes without justification draw scrutiny once timelines are forced into the open. Lauren's transformation during this phase was subtle but revealing. Her confidence gave way to control, then to interrogation. She questioned her attorneys aggressively, demanded reassurance, and began filing motions that contradicted her earlier narrative of victimhood. Through a professional acquaintance, I learned that Thomas Reed had assured her everything remained under control, even as he worked frantically to contain the damage. His mistake was believing influence could neutralize documentation the way it always had. Influence falters when multiple institutions are compelled to compare records, because power thrives in isolation, not transparency. The decisive shift came when an independent oversight body requested clarification regarding scheduling anomalies tied to my case. That request carried no accusation, only curiosity, but curiosity is fatal to corruption. Phone calls went unanswered. Private meetings dissolved. For the first time since this began, I felt the ground stabilize beneath my feet, not because I had struck back, but because the system itself was beginning to correct under the weight of its own contradictions. By the time the oversight inquiry widened, the atmosphere around my case had changed in ways that were impossible to hide, even from those who had benefited most from the original scheme. The confidence that once permeated Lauren's legal filings evaporated, replaced by cautious language, delayed submissions, and requests for extensions that contradicted her earlier urgency. I was no longer treated as an obstacle to be removed quickly, but as a variable that needed to be managed carefully. Investigators did not approach me as an aggrieved spouse seeking sympathy, they approached me as a fixed point in a timeline that no longer made sense. Sitting across from them in neutral conference rooms, answering their questions slowly and precisely, I understood that my greatest advantage was restraint. I never speculated. I never accused. I simply explained what existed on record and what did not, allowing the gaps to speak louder than any outrage ever could. Thomas Reed's carefully cultivated invisibility began to fail him as scrutiny spread beyond my individual case. Advisory emails were requested. Calendar entries were cross-checked. Financial disclosures tied to his consultancy work were examined against the outcomes of cases he had advised on. Patterns that once seemed coincidental became statistically uncomfortable when viewed together. People who had once returned his calls instantly began protecting themselves, offering partial cooperation, distancing statements, and carefully worded recollections that placed responsibility everywhere except where it belonged. Influence, I learned, is powerful only when people believe it is safer than truth. The moment that calculation changes, loyalty dissolves quickly. Thomas attempted damage control through quiet channels, but containment was no longer possible once multiple agencies were involved. Transparency is relentless when it is no longer optional. Lauren's response to this shift revealed more about her than any document ever could. She reached out indirectly, suggesting mediation, revised settlements, and mutual withdrawals that would have ended scrutiny immediately. Her tone was no longer triumphant but transactional, as if our marriage and its collapse were merely a deal that could still be renegotiated. I declined without anger or explanation, understanding that engagement would signal vulnerability. Each refusal forced her to continue operating within a process she no longer controlled. In court, her testimony became defensive, her statements more rehearsed, and her credibility visibly strained under questioning that focused not on emotion, but on sequence and consistency. The narrative she had constructed so carefully began to fracture, not because it was challenged aggressively, but because it could not withstand sustained attention. The decisive moment did not arrive with a dramatic ruling or a public accusation. It arrived quietly, through disclosure. An internal report circulated among oversight bodies identified systemic concerns tied to expedited rulings, valuation irregularities, and unauthorized coordination across multiple cases, mine included. Names were not immediately publicized, but consequences followed with precision. Judges were reassigned. Consultants were suspended pending review. Settlements were reopened under supervisory authority. What had once felt like a personal war revealed itself as part of a larger correction, and that realization changed how I experienced the outcome. This was no longer about my losses alone. It was about a system confronting the evidence of its own vulnerability. When the revised orders were finally issued, restitution came incrementally rather than triumphantly. Assets were unfrozen. Transfers were invalidated. Professional restrictions were lifted. There was no apology attached to any of it, no acknowledgement of the months I had spent watching my life dismantled in real time. Yet as I walked out of that last hearing, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I had defeated anyone, but because I had survived something designed to erase me. Lauren avoided my gaze entirely, already shrinking into the anonymity she once manipulated so expertly. Thomas Reed was absent, his name now spoken cautiously rather than reverently in professional circles. Certainty, once their greatest weapon, had become their undoing. And in that quiet hallway, surrounded by strangers who now treated me with measured respect, I understood that the most effective revenge is not destruction, but exposure, and the patience to let it do its work. When the final orders were entered and the oversight review formally concluded, I expected to feel triumph, or at least relief sharp enough to resemble victory. What I felt instead was a deep, steady quiet, the kind that settles after a storm has exhausted itself. The system did not apologize, and I had long since stopped expecting it to. It corrected itself clinically, restoring assets, reversing improper transfers, and issuing procedural findings that acknowledged misconduct without assigning dramatic language. My name was cleared not through praise, but through absence, my file no longer flagged, my contracts reinstated, my professional standing normalized as if nothing had happened. That normalization, strangely, was the most validating part of all. It meant the lies had lost their grip. I returned to work cautiously, aware that reputations damaged publicly do not heal instantly, but I found that quiet consistency spoke louder than defense ever could. People watched, waited, and then slowly trusted again. Lauren disappeared from my daily reality with unsettling speed, as though the role she had played no longer existed once scrutiny replaced secrecy. I heard fragments through distant channels, changes in employment, strained professional relationships, relocations that suggested retreat rather than opportunity, but I never sought confirmation. Curiosity would have tethered me to a past I was determined to leave behind. What struck me most was not her downfall, but her irrelevance. The woman who had once orchestrated every detail of our shared life no longer occupied any meaningful space in my thoughts. That absence was not bitterness, it was freedom. I had spent months defined by reaction to her actions, and reclaiming my inner narrative felt like reclaiming stolen property more valuable than anything listed on a balance sheet. Thomas Reed's fall was quieter but far more consequential within the circles that once empowered him. His consultancy was suspended indefinitely pending multiple reviews, his invitations to speak evaporated, and his name became a liability rather than an asset. No single charge defined his undoing. Instead, it was the accumulation of scrutiny that dismantled him, the same method he had once used to operate safely in the margins. Watching that transformation from a distance reinforced something I had learned the hard way: systems do not need heroes to correct themselves, but they do require witnesses willing to document rather than dramatize. Influence thrives on invisibility. Once exposed to sustained light, it withers without resistance. Margaret Collins returned to her quiet routines as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, refusing credit and avoiding discussion. She reminded me, gently, that truth rarely arrives through confrontation. It arrives through patience, timing, and the willingness to let evidence exist longer than denial can survive. Her role in my survival was never about strategy alone, it was about perspective. She had seen enough cycles of power to understand that corruption collapses not when it is shouted down, but when it is forced to explain itself repeatedly. I carried that lesson with me as I rebuilt, choosing discretion over declaration in every area of my life. In the months that followed, I rebuilt deliberately. I downsized my living space, simplified my finances, and redrew boundaries I had once assumed were unnecessary. Trust, I learned, is not the absence of questions, but the presence of accountability. I no longer equated love with access, or partnership with surrender of oversight. These realizations did not harden me, they clarified me. I became more selective with people, more intentional with commitments, and more forgiving of myself for the blindness that had once nearly destroyed me. Survival, I realized, is not about becoming colder. It is about becoming clearer. Sometimes I revisit the memory of that folded list Margaret slid across the table, the one titled How Everything Was Taken. I no longer see it as an inventory of loss. I see it as the first honest document in a process built on fiction. It forced me to confront not only betrayal, but my own assumptions about fairness, authority, and security. I did not win by outsmarting my enemies. I won by refusing to become what they needed me to be: emotional, reckless, predictable. I stayed present. I stayed factual. I stayed patient. This story is not about revenge in the way most people understand it. I did not destroy lives, expose secrets for spectacle, or seek applause for endurance. What I did was refuse erasure. I allowed the system to confront itself by holding still while its contradictions surfaced. And in doing so, I learned something that will stay with me far longer than the scars of this experience. When you protect truth with discipline instead of rage, injustice eventually collapses under the weight of its own maintenance. What survived after everything else burned was not just my career or my assets. It was my identity, no longer borrowed, manipulated, or defined by someone else's scheme, but fully, finally, my own. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.